Good morning. Here is a question that I often get asked by buyers and sellers of residential real estate. And the question is, who pays for the closing costs? And the answer is, it depends on which closing cost you are speaking of. In a real estate transaction, buyers and sellers, each of them have their own set of closing costs that they are responsible for. On the seller side, primarily you'll see the real estate commission as the primary seller closing expense. But the seller has more than that. They'll pay an attorney to prepare a deed. They will pay normally for a termite inspection, a well or septic inspection. They'll pay taxes that are specific to them, the seller. And the buyer, they have their own set of closing costs, usually more line items the buyer has as far as closing costs goes, not necessarily more expense, but the buyer, their closing costs center around, first and foremost, their lender. As they go to borrow money, typically there'll be an origination fee due to the lender. There will be discount points if they're getting a lower rate and willing to pay some extra upfront to get that. There will be other bank associated fees. They'll pay for an appraisal, and outside of that, the actual closing, the buyer is going to pay an attorney or a settlement company to do the closing for them, to search the title, to provide title insurance. And there are some items that are truly closing costs that sometimes don't get mentioned under that umbrella of closing costs. We call them prepaid items. So the buyer will normally have to pay a year's worth of homeowner's insurance up front, plus a couple of months to go into an escrow account. So the escrow account will be ready to pay the next time that insurance is due. They'll also pay some real estate taxes up front to go into that escrow account so that taxes can be paid. So there's closing costs and prepaid items, both of which in a broad sense can be called closing costs. Now, just because each party, the buyer and the seller, have their own sets of closing costs, it doesn't mean that one can't pay the other's closing costs in negotiations. And over the years, it's been very common for a buyer to ask a seller to pay X amount of dollars towards their closing cost. We haven't seen it as much here recently because it's been more of a seller's market. But if it's a situation where the buyer doesn't have enough cash to complete the transaction or wants to reserve some funds of theirs so that they can pay to have things done to the house after they buy it, they may very well ask that the seller pay $5,000 towards their closing costs, $10,000, whatever it is they want to ask. And the seller can say yes or no. We've seen many sellers over the years agree to that. Sometimes in a more seller-dominated market, they'll agree to it, but only if the price is raised to offset the cost of them paying the buyer's closing costs. And sometimes that created a win-win situation, still does, as long as the house appraises for that increased price. One thing we've seen in recent years that we haven't seen much of ever is the buyer paying some of the seller's closing costs. Why would they do that? Well, in a competitive market, the buyer's objective is to make the deal as sweet as possible for that seller, make it hard for the seller to say no to their offer. And in doing so, sometimes we've seen that where the buyer says, hey, we'll pay $5,000 towards your closing cost, Mr. or Mrs. Seller. And bottom line is the bottom line. It puts more money in the seller's pocket, and sometimes that, again, creates a finalized transaction. Lastly, when it comes to closing costs, you've seen lenders advertise no closing costs. Use us and you'll have no closing costs. Well, remember this, there are always closing costs. Sometimes semantics play a role in that. We're not calling this closing costs, we're calling these closing costs. And how can a company do that and stay in business? Because again, a big chunk of the closing cost is for lender fees. the lender has to make money or they won't be around very long. So, depends on the lender as to how they structure that, but oftentimes, the interest rate will be higher with a lender like that. And it might be worth it to a buyer to reduce their closing costs and to have a higher rate, because it can maybe reduce the amount that they have to have up front, but in the long run, it gets paid. It has to get paid. And what other ways? Well, sometimes you get no closing costs through a certain lender if you use their title company and you use people that they have lined up who are ready to do these services at a reduced fee. But the closing costs are there. They get paid for some kind of way. So just rest assured that whether it's certain taxes, transfer taxes or otherwise that aren't included in what they're calling closing costs, or other fees that just aren't considered part of that. There are fees, there are expenses, and they get paid by someone, and oftentimes it'll be by the borrower who has been told, come with us, there's no closing costs. So, little insight on closing costs today. Hope you have a fantastic week.